The leather on the armchair in my tiny apartment was peeling, just like the cheap wallpaper, but it was mine. That was my motto. Self-made, self-sustained. I was 28, a freelance designer, and perfectly content with my hard-fought independence. Then the phone rang. A clipped, formal voice introduced himself as Harold Sterling, executor of the estate of Arthur Sterling. My heart didn't skip a beat, it stopped dead. I regret to inform you that your grandfather, Arthur Sterling, recently passed away, he said, his tone colder than a granite tomb. My grandfather. A man I had never known, never even heard of. Then came the gut punch that dissolved my carefully constructed reality. And you, Miss Olivia Sterling, are the sole beneficiary of his entire estate. I felt a toxic wave of excitement and dread. An estate worth hundreds of millions. The very next sentence chilled me to the bone. I must also inform you that certain other family members have expressed interest in the proceedings. Namely, your parents. The parents who abandoned me 19 years ago were suddenly back in my orbit. They weren't coming for closure. They were coming for the cash. I knew this was not going to be a simple inheritance. It was going to be a war. The memory of the phone call kept me wide awake for nights, forcing open the mental door I'd slammed shut 19 years earlier. I was 9 years old when James and Sarah Winters, my biological parents, decided I was excess baggage. They weren't addicts, they were hustlers. Their life wasn't about stability, it was about the next score, the next pyramid scheme, the next insurance fraud payout. They dragged me across 3 states, living out of cheap motels and eating takeout. The hushed, frantic arguments weren't about gambling debts. They were about how to cover their tracks before the law caught up. The day they abandoned me remains a vivid, painful snapshot. It was a cold Tuesday evening in Oklahoma. My mother, Sarah, told me we were playing a game. We're going to hide, sweetie, and you have to wait for us right here. If anyone asks, you don't know us. She deposited me on a faded bench outside a sterile, red brick building, the local children's home. My father, James, gave me a cheap, plastic watch. When the big hand hits the 12, we'll be back, he promised, his eyes completely empty. I watched their beat-up sedan disappear down the street, clinging to that flimsy promise. The big hand hit the 12, then the 1, then the 2. They never came back. For the next 9 years, the foster system was my world. Instability was the air I breathed. I was determined to be invisible, to require nothing from anyone. But then, when I was 15, I landed with Helen. She wasn't a hero in a mansion. She was a quiet, retired schoolteacher living in a modest house filled with the smell of cinnamon and old books. Helen never asked about my parents, never pressured me to cry, but she demanded effort. She taught me to channel my anger into my studies, and my creative energy into design. Your circumstances were chosen by them, Olivia, she would say, tapping my workbook. But your future is chosen only by you. Helen was my rock, my first and only anchor in a world that had tried to float me away. When I turned 18, I was financially and emotionally ready to step into the world, thanks entirely to her. Now, standing on the brink of this fortune, I knew the betrayal of my childhood was about to be weaponized by the very people who inflicted it. They hadn't just abandoned a child, they'd created a survivor, and that survivor was about to face them. My life, built on threadbare resilience and $40 an hour design gigs, was about to collide with a fortune I couldn't comprehend. I met Mr. Sterling Harold, as he insisted I call him 3 days later at his downtown office. The building was all polished marble and quiet money, the kind of place that swallowed up secrets and spit out contracts. Harold Sterling was everything the voice on the phone suggested: precise, stoic, and dressed in a suit that probably cost more than my annual rent. He laid out the bare facts of the matter, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. My grandfather, Arthur Sterling, was a titan of the tech world, a reclusive figure known for his ruthless business acumen and impenetrable privacy. His death from a sudden heart attack had been kept quiet by his firm for a week. He owned patents, real estate across 3 continents, and a vast, complex financial empire. I had been named the sole heir, not just to the $8 million in liquid assets mentioned in the initial call, but to the entire Sterling holding group. Your grandfather, Miss Winters, Harold stated, adjusting his glasses, was aware of your existence. He was, in fact, responsible for ensuring your security and education since the age of 9 through a confidential trust managed by this firm. He never made contact, believing that interference would compromise your independent development. It was a strange, cold comfort. My abandonment hadn't gone unnoticed, but my protector was a distant, pragmatic ghost. Then he addressed the complication, the family members. Harold explained that my parents, James and Sarah, had already contacted the firm, claiming that since their parental rights were never formally and irrevocably terminated by the state only relinquished for money, they maintained a legal claim. They argued that a 8-year-old female beneficiary who grew up in the foster system was incapable of managing a corporate empire, and they, as her biological guardians, should step in as conservators. They have retained aggressive counsel, Harold warned, his gaze finally meeting mine. And they believe this is their second chance at wealth. They are banking on the chaos of a complicated will to exploit the ambiguity of your past. We must present a united, resolute front at the reading next week. I need you to understand that they are not coming for a reunion, Olivia. They are coming for the keys. I nodded, the word keys feeling like a heavy, cold metal pressed against my palm. I was no longer an independent designer. I was a target. And for the first time since that painful Tuesday in Oklahoma, I felt a flicker of the cold, determined resolve that Arthur Sterling himself was known for. I wasn't just defending a fortune. I was defending the life I had built without them. The day of the will reading felt less like a formal ceremony and more like an execution. Harold's private conference room was all mahogany and muted silence, but the air crackled with a frantic, desperate energy. I wore a charcoal suit, the kind that screamed competence, not wealth, a deliberate armor against the spectacle I knew was coming. I was already seated when they arrived. The door swung open, and there they stood, James and Sarah Winters. 19 years had done strange things to them. They were no longer the frantic, greasy hustlers I remembered. They were polished, dressed in designer clothes that looked tailor-made for a magazine spread, yet their eyes still held that hungry, calculating glint. My mother's face, tight from cosmetic work, broke into a wide, theatrical smile. "Olivia, our precious girl!" Sarah rushed forward, attempting an embrace I rigidly avoided. Her perfume was overwhelming, a sickeningly sweet cloud of manufactured affection. My father, James, approached with a practiced sincerity that was utterly hollow. "We never stopped thinking about you, honey, not for a single day. What happened? It was never your fault." He attempted to take my hand, but I clasped them together firmly in my lap. "Never my fault?" The phrase felt like a deliberate lie designed to pave the way for their next con. Harold Sterling cleared his throat, his presence a stabilizing weight in the room. He began the formality, reading Arthur Sterling's elegant, precise language. The preamble detailed my grandfather's gratitude for the life he lived, his commitment to innovation, and his singular desire to ensure his legacy was passed to the person he deemed worthy. Then came the core declaration, the words that finally justified their grand return. My billionaire grandfather left me everything, a mansion and $200 meters. The room went silent. James and Sarah exchanged a look not of pride, but of pure, predatory triumph. James leaned forward, interrupting Harold before he could continue with the details of the trusts and the Sterling Group ownership. "Excuse me, Mr. Sterling," James interjected smoothly. "While this is a lovely gesture, it is an overwhelming amount for a young woman who, well, frankly, lacks the necessary experience or guidance. But fortunately for Olivia, Sarah and I are here now. My parents who abandoned me 19 years ago suddenly showed up at the will reading." Sarah placed a perfectly manicured hand on the table, her smile tightening into something cold and triumphant. "We understand our legal obligations, and we are ready to resume our duty immediately. We'll set up a joint account for management, naturally." She paused, savoring the moment, the perfect villain in this sordid play. "We're your guardians," they smirked. At that precise moment, the door to the conference room opened with a soft click, and Harold Sterling's young associate, a sharp woman named Eleanor, wheeled in a cart stacked impossibly high with binders, folders, and a large digital screen. Harold Sterling stood up slowly, calmly walking around the mahogany table until he was standing directly behind me. He looked not at my parents, but directly at the stack of documents, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. But when my lawyer came in, they turned pale. A chilling silence fell across the room, broken only by the quiet hum of Eleanor's laptop. James and Sarah, who seconds earlier had been smugly planning my financial future, now stared at the mountainous stack of binders with a look of dawning, sickly horror. Their smooth, polished masks were cracking. Harold Sterling returned to his seat, but his energy had shifted. He was no longer just an executor, he was a gladiator preparing for battle. "Mr. and Mrs. Winters," Harold began, his voice dry and steady. "You asserted that you are Miss Winters' guardians. I believe you are operating under a legal fiction, one conveniently maintained to serve your financial aims today." He nodded at Eleanor, who brought up a digitized document on the large screen. "When you abandoned your 9-year-old daughter on October 14th, 19 years ago, the state of Oklahoma initiated proceedings. However, Arthur Sterling, your father, stepped in. He directed this firm to handle the complexities. And while you, Mr. and Mrs. Winters, did voluntarily sign away your parental rights in exchange for a modest settlement that you claimed would cover relocation expenses." Harold paused, letting the implication hang. "Mr. Sterling insisted on a formal, irrevocable termination of all parental rights by the court. He did this specifically to ensure you could never return to interfere with Olivia's life or financial well-being. This document, signed by a family court judge, is the final decree, dated December 10th, 19 years ago." The color drained completely from Sarah's face. She looked at James, her eyes wide with frantic, silent accusation. "That's a lie! We signed an agreement, not a termination," James roared, slamming his fist onto the table. The legal papers rattled. "My father paid us off and then stole our daughter. He fabricated that decree." "Fabrication is a strong charge, Mr. Winters," Harold said calmly, unfazed by the volume. He gestured to Eleanor, who pulled up a series of financial records and surveillance photos. "Eleanor, please show them the documentation concerning the subsequent attempts to contact Mr. Sterling." The screen flashed with dates, dollar amounts, and brief descriptions. "Attempted extortion via anonymous letter demanding $50 Kelvins, 2009. Contact initiated at Mr. Sterling's private residence, requesting funds for new business venture, 2014. I felt a cold wave of vindication wash over me. It wasn't just me they abandoned. They spent the next 2 decades trying to bleed the man who saved me. "Your father, Arthur Sterling," Harold continued, his voice softening slightly as he looked at me, "had eyes everywhere. He didn't want you to know he was watching, but he ensured you were safe, protected, and provided for, even paying for your education at the prestigious Rhode Island School of Design. He did not steal you, Mr. Winters. He simply filled the void you created." James lunged half out of his chair, his expensive facade finally shattered, replaced by the cornered ferocity I remembered from my childhood. "He resented me. He always resented me for leaving his gilded cage. He used his money to control everyone, and now he's using it to twist the knife one last time. He bought you, Olivia. He bought your entire future." I finally spoke, my voice low and steady, cutting through the sudden chaos. "You're wrong, Dad. He didn't buy my future. You sold it." My father flinched, but the look of hurt was fleeting, immediately replaced by a surge of white-hot fury. "Sold it?" James's voice cracked, and he slammed his hands down on the table, leaning across the mahogany. "Don't you dare talk to me about selling anything. That old man resented me my entire life. He gave us just enough money to disappear, to get out of the city and escape the debts that were closing in on us, and now you stand there in your fancy suit, talking about selling your life? We were scared, Olivia. We were desperate. And what did he do? He used it as an excuse to finally cut me out entirely and mold you into his perfect little heiress." Sarah, now openly sobbing, reached a trembling hand toward me. "Please, darling, we were sick. Your father was under terrible pressure and I couldn't get out of bed. We thought you'd be better off. We thought the system would place you with a good, stable family. We just needed time to get back on our feet, and every time we looked up, the years had just flown by. The performance was nauseating. I took a deep breath, my voice cutting through their theatrical display, colder and harder than the diamond on Sarah's finger. 19 years, I stated, counting off the years on my fingers as if marking off an overdue bill. 19 years you had to send one letter, one cheap birthday card, one anonymous email saying, "We didn't forget you. You checked on the money, Dad. Mr. Sterling just proved you were calling and extorting my grandfather, but you never checked on me." I looked directly at my father. You weren't sick. You were criminals who prioritized your scams over your child. And you, Mom, I turned to Sarah, whose tears were now flowing freely. You didn't choose a stable family for me. You dumped me on a cold bench outside a government building and let the state decide my fate. I didn't get placed with a perfect family. I lived in half a dozen temporary homes. I ate dinner with strangers. I learned to make myself small so I wouldn't get in anyone's way. The raw honesty hit them. James finally looked away, his jaw working furiously. You talk about being molded? I pressed on, my voice rising. My grandfather, this cold billionaire you despise, at least hired people to make sure I had clothes and an education. But the person who actually raised me? Her name is Helen. She was a retired school teacher who took me in when I was 15. She was a stranger, yet she showed up for every parent-teacher night and helped me with my college essays. Helen didn't give me money, but she gave me consistency. That's something you two, my own blood, were never willing to spare. Don't you dare compare that woman to us, James exploded, standing up and slamming his chair back against the wall. We gave you life. You are an ungrateful, cold little snob. You think a stranger's consistency is worth more than blood? I stood up, meeting his rage with icy calm. Yes, I do. You gave me DNA. Helen gave me a future. And now you're here, not because of a sudden pang of parental guilt, but because of the number after the $sign. You want to talk about being ungrateful? You're standing on the coattails of the man you tried to fleece, demanding money from the daughter you abandoned. Your definition of family is a transaction. And this transaction, gentlemen and ladies, is now closed. End of chapter. My father stood frozen for a moment, his face a sickening mix of rage and disbelief. He had no more arguments, only threats. You think this is over, Olivia? You're dealing with sharks? You won't last 6 months running that empire, and when you crash, don't come crawling to us. Before he could escalate further, Harold pressed a discreet button under the table. 2 massive, silent men in dark suits appeared instantly at the door. Mr. and Mrs. Winters, Harold said, his voice entirely dismissive now. This meeting is concluded. Any further communication with Miss Winters will be considered harassment and dealt with accordingly. Sarah let out a final, dramatic wail as the guards gently but firmly steered them toward the exit. You'll regret this. Family is all you have. As the door clicked shut, the silence that fell was thick and heavy, not with tension, but with emotional debris. I didn't move. I felt physically hollowed out, as if the last 19 years of buried anger had been violently ripped from my chest. Harold waited patiently until I finally sank back into my chair, my hands shaking. Are you all right, Olivia? I nodded slowly. I'm lighter. Thank you, Harold, for everything. He collected the scattered papers with methodical calm. Your grandfather was a man who believed in purpose over profit. That brings us to the most important part of the will. The financial figures are substantial. Yes, the mansion, the $200 in liquid assets, and the controlling shares of the Sterling Group. But the core of the inheritance is not monetary. Harold opened the last plain manila folder. Your grandfather was intensely aware of your background. He saw the strength you forged through the foster system, and he respected the woman you became despite them. Therefore, the bulk of his liquid assets, and a percentage of the annual company profits, are conditionally dedicated to the Arthur Sterling Foundation for Abandoned Youth. My breath caught in my throat. A foundation? For kids like I was? Precisely. It is mandated to provide stable housing, therapeutic resources, and educational funding for young adults aging out of the foster care system. And there is a final stipulation. You must serve as the foundation's chairwoman and primary executive. He stipulated that this responsibility is non-negotiable and non-transferable. The purpose was immediate and profound. This wasn't just money, it was a mission. My grandfather hadn't just given me an easy life. He had given me a way to validate every painful moment I had endured. It was his final, silent lesson. Turn your wounds into wisdom. I looked down at my hands, the hands of a survivor, not an heiress. The decision was instantaneous. Tell me where to sign, Harold, I said, the hollowness replaced by a fierce, driving sense of clarity. I accept the entire inheritance, and I accept the responsibility. I think I finally know what I'm supposed to do with all this. 6 months dissolved into the smooth, silent operations of the Sterling Group. I moved into the mansion, not as an intruder, but as the owner. I installed minimalist art, swapped out heavy velvet curtains for linen, and converted the intimidating mahogany study into the bright, functional headquarters for the new Arthur Sterling Foundation for Abandoned Youth. The mansion felt less like a museum and more like a home, a fortress, built by my grandfather, now occupied and humanized by me. Running the foundation was the hardest, most rewarding work I had ever done. We provided stability for young adults aging out of foster care, the safety net I'd never had. Every success story, every student accepted into college, felt like a direct counterattack against the neglect of my own childhood. I was honoring a man I never met, whose silent protection had allowed me to create this life. My final emotional commitment was to Helen. I drove to her modest house, carrying the full stack of legal documents, the termination papers, the trust details, the will. She listened quietly in her cinnamon-scented kitchen as I laid out the entire bizarre, dramatic story. When I finished, she didn't offer pity or shock, just a soft smile. You know, Olivia, she said, pouring me a cup of tea, that Mr. Sterling may have paid the bills, but you did the work. You always had the strength to choose the right path, even when it was dark. Then I told her about the foundation, about the mansion, and about the legacy my grandfather had entrusted to me. I looked at the woman who had taught me the true meaning of a commitment. The woman who had simply showed up every single day for 3 years. I know the world sees Arthur Sterling as my benefactor, I said, my voice thick. But you, Helen, you are my family. You are the one who taught me what consistency and love look like. I finally allowed myself to say the word I had never dared utter to anyone but my father's empty watch. Mom. Helen reached across the table, her hand warm and calloused, and squeezed mine. She didn't correct me. I never heard from James or Sarah again. Harold ensured the restraining order was airtight. They were banished to the past, their influence reduced to a cautionary tale. Their toxic, transactional love was an empty shell. My grandfather's distant, pragmatic love was a foundation of steel, but Helen's present, chosen love was the warm home built on top of it. I stood on the balcony of the mansion one evening, looking over the vast, manicured grounds. I hadn't inherited just money. I had inherited justice. I had inherited purpose. And I had finally understood that family isn't determined by blood, but by the unconditional commitment of those who choose to stay. That, more than $200M or any mansion, was the only inheritance that truly mattered.